What am I gonna say? Hey guys, welcome. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Hey guys, welcome back to our channel. We are Atypical Herps, and stick around to see what we have in store for you.
Okay, so today we're going to be talking to you about corn snake care. The reason we wanted to make this video so early into our channel is because we did a crested gecko video, and that's... I really hope that wasn't on mic. That's kind of like the best beginner gecko, so we kind of want to go into snakes now since that's the majority of our reptiles that we own. So in my opinion, corn snakes are definitely the best beginner pet because they can thrive in just about any condition. Obviously, you don't want to keep them in the worst conditions that you can possibly do, but they're fairly easy to take care of. So corn snakes are colubrids, which basically just means that they're a thinner, slender snake, and they're also, I just mind farted. They're also known as constrictors. So a lot of people don't think that they are because they're small. They're a small species, but they are. They are also known as rat snakes, but they're not commonly called that because rat snake is kind of its own species. So if you ever hear about rat snakes, they're in the same family. I believe that they're great beginner pets. The only thing that would make it hard for a beginner would be the handling, just because they're a little bit more active. If you can tell with him here, he does move around a lot. He's kind of spazzy, but he's not nearly as bad as like milk snakes. Milk snakes are... Have you ever held a milk snake?
Yeah, we used to get milk snakes out back at my parents' house when I was younger, and we'd try to hold them, and we couldn't even catch them. They were just so crazy.
They dart, and it's the worst thing ever. But they're not that bad. They just are a lot more active. So for people who are a little bit skittish with snakes, if you've never been experienced with them before, it can be kind of hard to get used to the handling. Otherwise, once you get used to it, they're fairly easy to keep control of. Also, they don't really bite. You don't really ever hear of corn snakes biting unless it's like a feeding response, which I hear about this a lot on our Facebook page that we're in. A lot of the time people are feeding by hand, which is never a good thing to do. You should always feed with tongs if you don't want to get bit. I mean, if you don't care about getting bit, then by all means.
Yeah, and to be honest, look at how tiny his head is. His teeth are not that big, so even if you were to get bit, it's not going to hurt very much.
No. I have yet to be bit, though. Have you been bit yet?
Oh, yeah. That guy at the reptile store made me get bit by a...
Oh, my God, he did?
Yeah, he did. He made me get bit by a corn snake.
Okay, how bad was it?
It didn't even leave a mark.
Okay, good. See, that makes me feel better.
Yeah.
That's like my biggest fear still.
Yeah,
and I hate snakes, which is fine. Anyway, so... apparently she got bit by a corn snake. You don't hear about that often. Yeah. You really don't. He's never been aggressive. He's never hissed, done strike pose at me. Not at all. He's just the sweetest snake ever. As far as a length... You're interrupting our video.
I'm part of the video. What are you talking about? I am the video.
Anyway, as far as adult length, they can get up to about 5 feet. Females are always going to get bigger than males for any type of snake that you have. He is about 2.5 feet right now, and the only reason I know that is because I measured his sheds. I measured his last shed, and it was about 2.5 feet. So he's about a year old right now, but it takes about 2 years for them to get full grown as far as adult size. Otherwise, he's got a full another year of growing. I hope he gets pretty big, but with my luck, he'll stay like 2.5 feet, and I'll be disappointed, but it's okay. He is also diurnal, so that just means that he really needs a day-night cycle. Some snakes, like boas, don't need that.
And ball pythons, yeah.
And ball pythons, but all of my snakes are really on a day-night cycle because of this guy. So sometimes people will say that you should use a light, like a UVB. Is it UVB? Yeah. None of my snakes need lights, so that's really, really nice, and it also saves electricity. Because let me tell you, 8 snakes with heat pads gets really expensive. Yeah. So just be aware of that if you're thinking about getting snakes, because they are like tattoos. They're really addicting.
And once you, to be honest, the difference in your electricity bill with one snake isn't gonna really make a huge difference. It's when you get 3 and 5 and 8 of them that you really start noticing.
It'll happen before you know it, too. It's the problem. So we talked about day-night cycle. I basically just leave the blinds open, and when it's day, it's day. When it's night, and they're fine with it. But with them being diurnal, they are out and about day and night. So it really just depends on the season. I've noticed that he's been out and about a lot more now than he usually is in the summer. So I don't know too much information on as far as seasons go, what time they're usually out and about. But he is very explorative. That's the word. He explores his cage a lot. He's always out. You can see him basically any time of the day, which is really, really cool, especially if you want to be able to see your pet. Because like ball pythons, you really are never going to see them.
Yeah, they pretty much hide. They're pretty nocturnal. So if you are also a night... Poof, wow, English. If you are also a night owl, then ball pythons might be a really great choice for you if you really take joy in being able to see your pet kind of moving around in their enclosure. If not, then a corn snake might be a better choice.
Yeah. There's a lot of controversy about cohabitating these snakes. As far as my opinion, I think the only snake that you should be cohabitating is garter snakes, just because they're known for that. But as far as any other type of snake, you should not be doing that. There are obviously king snakes. Any snake with the name king in it is a
Carnivorous.
Carnivorous, is that the word?
Well,
Cannibalistic.
Cannibalistic,
That's
yeah.
the thing. So they eat other snakes. You don't hear about corn snakes doing it very often, but they do.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really awful to see pictures of that. So I wouldn't cohabitate these snakes at all.
And it's also extremely stressful for them. So cohabbing snakes, usually the way people have their tank set up, they have like one really good hot spot, one really good cold spot, like maybe one water dish and a couple other like favorite spots that the snake might have. Cohabbing will stress them out because then they're competing for that one good spot, and they don't have the brain to know that like I'm a domesticated snake and my mom is taking care of me. All they know is that they're fighting for survival, and they think that this other snake is going to survive better than them because they're in the better spot. So it's just a very stressful situation for them, and it's better if you just don't put them in that situation.
Yeah, it's best to just not do that, because it would really suck to have 2 corn snakes in one tank and you come in one day and you've got one left.
Yeah.
Oh, that would be traumatizing. I could not imagine.
Yeah.
Oh, so as far as enclosure, obviously they're going to be pretty similar to every other snake or reptile. I mean, they're going to need hides. He's got a couple. He's got like 3 or 4 in his tank. Also a water dish, of course, like every other reptile, and a heat pad. I'm not a fan of like the heat rocks that people use, because I hear a lot about snakes burning themselves on them, and I'm not too sure if they can be regulated. So I just wouldn't suggest that. Heat pads are, I think, the safest way to go, and you should always have a thermostat on your heat pads because snakes will burn themselves. I've seen horror pictures of snakes just hanging out on the heat pad, and I've actually tested mine. It got up to 130 degrees without the thermostat on it. So
yeah. You could also use a ceramic heat emitter for a heat source. They're usually abbreviated as a CHE, and those are just like ceramic. They're non-light emitting bulbs, so all they emit is heat, and you can just have those on top of your enclosure if you prefer that. But it should still be really closely monitored to make sure you're not getting that enclosure too hot.
Yeah, and they also make stands as well. Like if your tank is pretty short, they can, when they're exploring at night, get too close to a heat source. I don't know if it'll be hot enough for them to burn themselves, but that's always something you kind of want to be aware of. As far as the heat spots go, anything above 92 degrees they really don't like. So I have my thermostat set to 90, and it will kind of fluctuate between like 88 and 90. It never goes over 90, which is really, really nice, and he loves it. But if it's any hotter than that, he just will not go near it because it's just too hot. As far as humidity goes, they do really good between like 50 and 60% humidity. Mine's usually a little bit higher than that. It usually sits around 70. Well, I guess 60 to 70, really. It fluctuates pretty often, but I have him in a tub right now, and that holds humidity pretty well. I keep him on cypress mulch and forest floor just because he likes to burrow, and he does really well with that. And I like the more natural look to my enclosures. But I had him on aspen. He did great with that. I actually did have him in a glass tank. There's a big debate on glass versus plastic tubs, and I've had him in both, and he's thrived in both. It really doesn't make a difference. I mean, if you're having a really hard time with humidity, then I'd say maybe do a tub, I guess, depending on where you live. But he's done great on both with me, so that's really nice. And another reason they're super easy, because ball pythons are very biggy.
Yeah.
So.
Keep in mind, these guys are North American snakes, so they do pretty much thrive in the conditions that you already have in your house. Of course, there are little tweaks and nuances to every species, so if you want to keep your husbandry perfect, that's fine. If it fluctuates a little bit, that's fine. These guys are really hardy. They're very tolerant for temperature and humidity fluctuations, so that's not something that you really have to worry about them if they're going to go off feed or something, because their humidity isn't exactly at 67%.
Yeah.
Ball pythons are a little bit more picky, and they'll go off feed a lot more often if their husbandry is off, but corn snakes are a lot easier to manage in that aspect.
Yeah, you don't really hear about corn snakes going on hunger strikes very often at all. I mean, he has never missed a feed. I've had him for... oh God, how long has it been? Like 8 months, I think, now. And you know what? We didn't even introduce him.
This is Flip.
This is Flip, my corn snake. He's a little over a year old. I think he's like a year and 3 months now. He's a tesseramorph corn snake. There's lots of different types of morphs out there. So if you don't like orange snakes, they have purple snakes, pink snakes,
white snakes,
all black ones, white ones. Like, there's so many different morphs out there. And another cool thing is corn snakes are usually fairly cheap. They're on the cheaper end of, as far as designer snakes go. It really depends on what morph you get. But, I mean, I got him for $100. So that was nice compared to my $400 snake, which is a ball python.
Yeah.
He was worth it, though. He was worth it. He's so cool. I really like that you mentioned the hardiness of them, because they're just so different. A lot of people will say that ball pythons are good beginner snakes, but
if you're worried about getting bit, ball pythons are excellent beginner snakes, but then again, so are corn snakes.
See, no, okay, that's really hard to say, because Celine, the one in this tank here, has bit just about everybody in this house.
If you can find yourself a friendly ball python, they're really great beginner snakes. I haven't had any issues. I have 2 ball pythons, and I have never even had either of them strike at me. None of them have ever S-posed at me or anything. So corn snakes, they don't really bite, but they are very mobile. Ball pythons tend to be more defensive, and when they get defensive, they just kind of curl up into a ball, hence the name ball python.
Yeah.
So it really is your preference. Ball pythons will get bigger, and they do require, like I said earlier, a little bit more specific husbandry. So it really takes some research to figure out which snake would be perfect for you for your first snake.
And just keep in mind that every snake has its own personality. I mean, they're really like any other pet that you would have. So I have how many? 4 ball pythons? And my last one, well, second to last one that I got, Celine, she's the only one that's ever given me problems as far as like being defensive, and none of the other ones. They've all been perfect. So it really just depends on the snake itself, if it's been handled a lot as a hatchling.
And it's pretty easy also to kind of work them out of that fear. It's going to take some time and patience and correct interactions. You have to be really careful with your interactions with them, because every single time you interact with your snake, especially if they're afraid of you or they're defensive, you want it to be a good interaction. So you don't want to cause them stress, you don't want to cause them fear, because that's just going to create a positive feedback cycle of every time this person opens my cage, something bad happens and I'm afraid of them. And then if you open their cage again and something bad happens again, then they're going to become more afraid of you. So you really want to focus on making every interaction intentional and positive.
Yes. And confidence is really key when it comes to snakes. I mean, like I said, corn snakes are just so gentle and so docile, but if you go to buy one and it's like striking for some reason, then you probably shouldn't get that one, especially if it's your first snake and you're nervous, because they're going to pick up on that. So definitely just keep that in mind.
And you don't want to like hover over them either when you're trying to pick them up. You kind of just want to go for it, because if you sit there and you're kind of like moving back and forth and trying to figure out the perfect angle to pick him up at, you look like a predator to them, and you look like someone who's going to try and eat him.
That is so good. I'm happy you mentioned that.
Yeah, so definitely just like you kind of like surprising them, I guess, works the best, because like you open their enclosure and they're like, oh, hey, and then you pick them up and they're like, oh my gosh, what's going on? And like nothing bad happens. So they're just kind of like,
Yeah.
Okay.
But if you sit there and you go in for it and then you kind of freak out and pull back and you do that multiple times, then they're going to get defensive and they're going to think possibly, not always, but possibly think like you're food or a predator. So definitely confidence is key. That was probably the hardest thing when I first owned snakes. It's just different. Like, you don't think it's going to phase you, but when you try to go reach into them, especially when he's fast. So I had to like chase him. But that's definitely something to keep in mind, is definitely be confident. And if it's something you think you can't handle, then maybe hold off unless you have somebody that is comfortable to help you out, because it's a big responsibility and we want to make sure that we're taking care of these animals the best that we can.
And while we're on the subject of avoiding being bitten, definitely making sure that you don't only open their enclosure to feed them, because then they associate, it's kind of like classical conditioning, they associate the opening of the tank with food. The tank opens, I need to get ready to eat. And if 10 times, like the last 10 times you open their enclosure was to feed them, then the 11th time they're going to be like, oh, we've done this before, it's time to eat. But you put your hand in there, they're going to try to bite you.
Yeah.
So making sure that you handle them 2 to 3 times a week. You usually don't want to go over that because it can get stressful for them. But like Lex said earlier, they do each have their own personalities, and some of them are less stressed by handling than others. So you definitely just kind of have to feel that out with each individual snake.
Yeah. I don't know if we mentioned feeding yet.
No.
I don't think so. So for feeding these guys, I feed them once a week. And typically you should feed them the girth of their body. With some snakes, you can feed them like a little bit wider than their girth. A lot of the times you'll hear their girth and a half, as far as that's the size of mouse that you should give them. But with these guys, I always feed him the size of his girth. And if there's something that's like a little bit bigger, it's slightly bigger to leave a slight bulge in his belly, but nothing more than that, because these guys are super prone to getting fatty liver disease. So
yeah. And
that's not good.
The size of prey, really, there are several factors that you need to consider. You should consider how often you feed them, and that can help you determine the size of your prey. So personally, me and Austin feed our snakes every 10 days. So we would tend to give them prey that might be a little bit bigger than if we were feeding them every 5 or 7 days.
Mm-hmm.
So just kind of feeling it out with your snake and what they have been eating and what you think they
can tolerate, really.
Can tolerate, yeah. So if you haven't fed them in 2 weeks and you give them a meal that's a little bit bigger than you usually do, that's perfectly fine. That's kind of making up for that energy that they had to expend those extra 7 days if you feed every 7 days. So
Yeah, so I feed every 7 days, and like I said, I feed like the exact girth. So right now he is on what is he on? Well, okay, so I'm feeding him. I kind of alternate. So I'll give him like mouse pinkies, and then I will upgrade him to like a fuzzy mouse like every other week. But I do feed him every 7 days, and it really just depends on what I have. And I'm feeding him frozen. When I first got him, I was feeding live, and he did fine with it. But I personally like to feed frozen just because it's easier. There's always a risk when you feed live, because the rat can scratch or bite the snake, so that's definitely something to keep in mind. You should never be feeding live unattended.
Yeah.
So if you're going to feed live, you need to be there, you need to be present and paying attention at all times, because there have been times where the rat has bit him or tried to bite him, but he's not really a shy eater, so I have tongs that I use to kind of block. I just don't like doing that. I would much rather feed frozen, especially if he can tolerate it. And it's also nice because you can buy multiple frozen of that size and it'll last you for however long. So that's really convenient. Just make sure that when you're feeding frozen that it's completely thawed and warm. Not too warm, obviously, but they sense with heat. So if it's not warm enough or it's still frozen in the middle, it can cause a lot of damage. So just be aware of that.
And if you're having a hard time transitioning, you want to transition your snake from live to frozen thawed, pre-killed is a really great option that me and Austin have been actually utilizing lately, especially as our snakes get onto larger prey, and the larger prey obviously can do more damage to the snakes. So there are a few of our snakes, particularly one of my ball pythons, surprise, surprise, that really doesn't like frozen thawed. So we've been trying to get him on pre-killed. He hasn't taken a pre-killed one yet. He likes the live ones. Well, he doesn't really like the live ones either. He's afraid of them. So for him, it's kind of like a feeling it out game. Like every week I have to feel him out and see, like, is he going to take a live one or should we maybe pre-kill it for him? Yeah. There's no real, like, exact manual for feeding your snakes. You kind of have to learn as you go, and you make mistakes, and sometimes you get a refusal, and you're like, what the heck do I do with this mouse? You can usually take it back to the pet store, and they'll give you store credit for it. Or just get a little container to keep them in and get some mouse feed and some mouse wheels and some toys, and now you got yourself a pet mouse.
Yeah, that happened to me. My biggest ball python hasn't eaten in 3 months, so we'll talk about that in another video.
Yeah.
I think. Damn it! We need to show you guys the enclosure, probably.
Wait, I thought you guys talked about it. Oh, you just.
We.
So this is Flip's enclosure.
Yep. Humidity gauges. That's probably a good thing to bring up. In the corner over here, there's his humidity and temp gauge. So that's definitely something that you need to keep in the enclosure. I have the back of his enclosure, obviously with some stuff on it, just because I like it to be personally blacked out at the back of it. He's got several hides here. He loves this tree. And a humidity hide is always important. If your humidity typically drops down fairly low, you should probably have a humidity hide, especially during times of shed. Usually he's been shedding every month on the dot, which is kind of crazy. So he's got his water bowl.
And in here we just have some peat moss, and when it gets dry you just spray it with some water, and it keeps it nice and humid in there.
Yep. And so his heat pad is on this side and his cool side is on this side, so that there is a temperature gradient and he can thermoregulate himself the way he chooses. I think we've covered just about everything, though.
Look at him doing a scope.
Hopefully we can try to get him close enough to the camera here so that you guys can kind of see him and his pattern.
Look at how precious.
Very, very sweet. He is kind of head shy, but that's a snake.
That's
just a snake.
Look at his head stamp.
Oh,
so handsome!
Skull on it, if you can see it.
So handsome.
But so as he gets bigger, he'll stay thin like this, and like I said, about 2.5 to 5 feet is the average
focus
length for them. So if you're thinking that you want a thinner, not so huge snake as your first pet, this is definitely a great option. But I think we covered everything. If we didn't, definitely drop a comment down below or message us on Facebook or Instagram and let us know. We will definitely try to answer your questions the best that we can, and keep an eye out for our next video. Thanks, guys. See you next time.